Brian from eMotimo, you have your monorail, you have a box from eMotimo with a bunch of stuff in it. We're going to show you how to unbox it and get your conductor hooked up to the monorail. You're going to find a couple different things. The conductor in a nice little soft case that fits everything perfectly, as well as another little box in here. Going on through this, the conductor is sitting in here, along with your remote, your AC adapter, your RSI, which allows you to connect to your DJI gimbal, and actually in there you're also going to watch out for this little package, which is the sensor that goes with this motor. You know what's in here. Let's go through and check out the inside of this little box. And what's in here is the motor and the hardware to connect it to the monorail. Let's take a quick look. Inside here, this is the motor pod. As you're opening it on up, keep track of everything inside it because there is potentially a loose spring in here that you need to keep. It allows the suspension to work. Pull that on out. Got some tape hooking that up. You've got a little hardware bag with 3 screws and a wrench. And you've got a little bag of stickers that will tell you what to do with later. At this point, we're ready to start installing stuff. To start with, we're going to install this motor pod. You're going to need the 2 long screws and the wrench out of your hardware bag. Pull those on out. Put those through. If you've got a piece of tape retaining that screw, pull that off. Put your spring on back. It sits between here and there. And what we're going to be doing onto a monorail that doesn't have anything attached to it except for the bottom plate. And we'd also recommend if you have a power base, you install that now, because when we install this motor pod, it's going to make it harder to access that. But motor pod install is really simple. We're coming in with these 2 screws, and on the top section of the monorail hangers right here, there's 2 screws, or there's 2 screw holes, through holes, that fit these 1/4 20. They should slide right on through. The orientation of the motor is as such. The wire's coming out the side to the right. The taper is on the left-hand side. Grab your wrench and fit it on up. Once you get a couple screws in there, or a couple threads in there, you can just use the long end of the wrench to snug that on up. You can come in lightly here, go medium tight. Do not go, as we say, gorilla. It's not going to help anything, and you could strip some things out. It's just enough to keep this thing tightened on up so it doesn't loosen over time. At this point, your motor should be mounted correctly. Reach on up to this nut and turn it and back it off so the nut is all the way down. And what that will do is release all the tension on the motor, and it's going to be very loose, which is where we want it to start. You're still going to need the screw and the last little piece of hardware, and now reach on into your sensor bag, and you're going to see the sensor, the cable attached to it. And what we're going to be doing with this is we're going to mount this up to the side, one side of the monorail. We've got a couple different ways we can do it. By default, and with this short sensor cable that we have, the preferred method is to install it on the left-hand side. It's better to actually remove the cable for the time being. Get it out of the way. Slide this on up. And from the bottom, you're going to thread that tiny screw on in. Sometimes easier to use the wrench. I'm bottoming this out, and I'm not tightening it up very much. In fact, I'm going to leave it loose, because the next step is I'm going to adjust it. The mount is loose, and what I'm doing is I'm pressing it fully into the monorail, pushing that sensor board all the way in lightly, and then I'm backing it off just slightly, looking down on it, trying to get everything even and the closest part about 1 millimeter away from the track. When I'm there, I just come up here using the long end of the wrench, and this is lightly tightening. You do not need to go down hard on it because the plastic of the motor mount will break if you go too hard on it. Just make it snug, your sensor board's installed. A quick note, if you've got a sensor board and a sensor board holder that is not rigidly holding onto this, you can either bend it a little bit with your hands to make it rigid, or a simple fix is using a small piece of tape to come across the top, attach to the board, and fixing it there. And in that way, your sensor board will not be shifting left and right, which is undesirable, as it will affect the calibration over time. From here it gets fun. We're going to take the conductor and we're going to mount it on up, connect the cabling, and power it on for the first time. There's a couple aftermarket accessories that are not included that you may want to pick up to help you out. One of which is a magic arm that allows us to connect the conductor to the monorail easily. And the other is a cold shoe mount for a battery that we're going to use, so we don't need to run wires. These are not included, but they're readily available. We'll send you some links. So let's get the conductor installed. From here, off the monorail on the corner, we've got a 1/4 20 that we're going to affix one side of the magic arm to. Get that nice and tight. The side of the conductor actually has some mounts. The airy rosettes there, it's also some on the bottom. Choose your mounting. For us, we're going to mount it like this. Once you're mounted on up, you'll immediately notice that we're front heavy on this. So our battery selection, we're going to take our cold shoe mount, make sure it's the right direction, and attach it to one of the back sides. There's no right way to do this, but we're balancing approximately the load of the motor and the conductor with the weight of a battery. At this point, the monorail can move back and forth and it's not tipping one side or the other. Balance is up to you though. You want this riding approximately level before you attach your camera system. The last thing we want to add that's going to power us up is the D-tap to 2.1 millimeter to power up your conductor. So off P-tap back here, being very careful of polarity with this awful, easily reversible power supply. Plug in your D-tap and then power up your conductor. Be careful here. So easy to provide reverse polarity for this. Once we're powered on up, we can go through, connect our remote. And we're live, but we're not moving yet. We need to go through and power up and connect our M1 motor, which is our monorail motor, to the M1 port. You're supposed to do this when it's off. Doesn't hurt to do it when it's on, but sometimes that motor will go into protection. You've got to restart. But from here, I jump into my live mode and I'm driving. Move into my quiet fast. I've got my rig running. But remember when we loosened up that motor, we've got to adjust it. We've got to provide the right tension, the right friction for this motor so it won't slip. It's always going to slip a little bit. We'll correct for it. But in this mode right here, it's not going to maintain its position. The motor is slipping. So when we're in our quiet fast mode, we've got a remote hooked on up. You've got to reach on down and start screwing that nut up. And what that's doing is it's providing a little more tension. It's compressing the spring lightly. And we want that spring, that suspension, to go through and push that wheel into the bottom of the track with enough force so it doesn't easily slip. Now, we could just keep on screwing it on there and put a lot of force on there, but too much force is going to compress these wheels, and if they stay for a long time in a hot environment, it's going to make those wheels get a flat spot that takes a little while to work out. So you want the right tension, which is not too little where it will slip, but not too much where it's really compressing things together. And the magic level for that is when we can tighten things up where we can provide a little bit of force, and eventually that's when the motor starts skipping. That's a good thing in that we are overpowering the motor. We provided a lot of friction. We can actually back this off a little bit so it's not so grippy. We can still make the motor skip, but we're not compressing as much. So you want to reach the point where you can get that motor to skip at top speeds, but at slow speeds, it's probably going to go through and just be able to skid that motor or skid that wheel out a little bit. We get reliable performance at this. You can hear the wheel is not skipping, it's gripping well. We've adjusted this about right, but it might take some time for you to figure out what's right for your system. A way you can check this. Down here, I'm going to almost hit the end. I can optically see where I am. And in my live menu, I'm going to go through and set up my go-to preset for that position. I'll send you some links for how to do this. But what this is we're setting a target position that we can recall when we press the circle button. So I'm going to move it on over here, just down the track, and 5 seconds later, we want to hit that mark. So when we're in this mode, you can go through and go right one until it says circle. And at this point, you put the caret over the target, move it to where you want it, press target, lock it on in. You can see the numbers change, and then from there, we can move the rig someplace else. When we press circle, it recalls that preset and moves it back to that position. It's right there. I'll do it again, all the way down to the other end of the track. Press my button to recall it. And if I'm within a couple millimeters, I've calibrated correctly. If I am running into it or I am way off of that, it still means my wheel is slipping. So check it on out. Make sure you're getting reliable performance on this, because what we're really doing here is we're adjusting that tension so that it can grip and it can drive this reliably. There's one more piece to this puzzle that we haven't added yet. This little cable is not connected. And what that's doing, tying the conductor to the sensor board, is what we need to do. Before we do that, I want to go through and jump into my main menu. We're going into the settings menu, we're going into the port settings, and we're making sure that we have external triggering set here. Locking that in. That turns on this port so we can start electronically listening to what comes in here. Your I/O port is on the side. These are locking connectors. Plug it on in, give it a little wiggle to make sure it's right, and it's not going to come loose. Shouldn't take any force when you align it correctly. And now at this point, we've powered up that sensor board, but there's nothing for it to sense. Well, actually, in fact, it is sensing the track, but what it is not sensing is these little stickers. Take these guys out of the box. There's 3 of them. For our early batches, we've included 2 big ones and 1 small one. The big ones are going to go at the ends of the track. They're going to serve as our end stops. The middle one is going to be a constant calibration for when we run over it. And these sensors need to be in a position that the sensor board can read. So when we're applying this, and we can apply the one approximately in the middle. It doesn't need to be perfectly in the middle, but when we're doing this, we want to apply this to the track so that there's 2 sensors on here. We're centered top to bottom. I'll do that now. And after we do that, we'll run over it to see if our sensor board is reading. It doesn't need to be precise, but it needs to be vertical, and it needs to span the length of the track right here so that the sensor board can read it. And now I'm going to go back to my live motion using my left-right. I'm going to drive along, and I'm going to slowly run over those sensors. And I don't know if you can see this. Come on over. But as we drive over this tape, we're seeing first, when we go left, a green, and then we're seeing a red. And that's a good indication in that we are sensing that marker. If you see both of those and they're reliable and they are lighting up, not flickering, it's the other test is we've put that sensor board in the right spot and you're sensing things correctly and we're getting sharp marks for where that resides. Once you've positioned the middle sensor, The next part is to create your end stops. And these are pretty easy to do, but I would grab yourself a little pencil here, and I'll show you how it can work. First of all, if you go through and you crash this, it's not that big a deal. You're not going to break things unless you're smashing your camera into something. But you want to give yourself the optical end stop a little bit, call it an inch or two before you run into the track. So on the left-hand side, let's start here. What we want to do is put that end stop, let's say we want that end stop to be fully registered right here. On this sensor board, you can see two vertical lines, one here and one here. We're going to create a pencil mark so we can drive off this thing and we can know where we were around that right-hand line. This is the left-hand stop. We're using the right-hand line. We're putting a small mark there. I'm going to drive this out of the way. Let's stay there. And then I'm going to apply that tape. At that point. Now when I run back on over here, at that point, you're going to see two lights light on up. It's indicating end stop, and we still have that little bit of buffer before we run into the end. Call it about an inch. We're going to do the same thing on the right-hand side. Grab your pencil, move the track on over. We can run on into it right here. Give yourself about an inch back. And this time what we're going to do is we're going to put the sensor mark on the left-hand side right here. We're going to give ourselves a little bit right there. We're going to back this out of the way. And we're going to apply it to the right of that. Now when we drive on in, we get both those lights, and we get about an inch before we run into the end. So we unboxed, we mounted the motor, we mounted the sensor, we adjusted the motor, we adjusted the sensor, and we checked it all together in a system test where we hooked it up and ran it back and forth. We're in pretty good shape. The last step is going to be updating your firmware. Take a look at the links in the support module for how to do that. We're constantly updating this with our first rounds, and there's going to be a few more updates as we perfect it, but stay tuned. We look forward to see what you make.